Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Welcome, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey.
With no technical difficulties today, yay!
Unlocking Your Truth is a talk show about metaphysics and spirituality. And so every week we have a different topic under that umbrella. And we broadcast on 101.7 FM across the Fraser Valley from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation. But you can also catch us on any of the main podcasting platforms. And I should also, by the way, I forgot to say that the radio station is CIVL. And you can get a sneak peek ahead of time, ahead of the game. You can watch us record the shows live if you join our Awaken Your Psychic Abilities Facebook group, or you watch us live streaming on YouTube. Well, today's episode is a little bit of a different one. And it's actually, we're building an episode around a question that was sent in by one of our listeners. And I am going to read his whole question. But basically, what he said was, I believe that history is bunk. And I think what he was getting at is that, how do we know?
No, actually, that comes from, he didn't know where he heard it, but that comes from if I remember correctly, some sort of a movie or something.
Right. Well, so this is what he wrote to us. A quote that I agree with is, history is bunk. Getting an accurate representation of what has happened in the past is nearly impossible. And then he says to me, since you're in communication with archangels, they would have the long view. And I am especially interested in the last 40,000 Earth years. And DNA suggests that that was a very important time for the species. And also the last 8,000 years appears to be even more pivotal for the Earth. And then he says, I, of course, have my own idea of how things played out, but it would not be well received. So he doesn't tell us what it is. The archangels would be able to put a better spin on it. And my feeling is that the last 40,000 years have been very, very turbulent for even the archangels. And hopefully once we get past the next 10 years, rebuilding can start in the promised age of Aquarius. And then the challenge is making the scope of the topic manageable, which is true. How can you cover the entire history of planet Earth in a 1-hour radio show? Well, you can't really, but we'll do our best. We'll do our best to approach this question in interesting, intuitive ways.
We'll just have to talk really fast, Dr. Leslie.
Yeah, we should play the Big Bang Theory's theme tune. That goes through quite a lot of it really quickly. So I don't know that I'm going to channel the archangels to answer this question. We'll see. But one thing that I will mention is I've been doing past life readings for about 22 years. And I was thinking about this when I was thinking about this question, because through those past life readings, I've been exposed to all the different eras and cultures on Earth, because people come to me with a variety of experiences. And I reckon that I've read between 10 and 50,000 past lives, depending on how many you say I've done a year. It's a lot. So I'll definitely comment on that. So let's just quickly briefly touch upon some of the things that he said in his, I think it's okay to say Dennis, isn't it? Dennis, thank you for the question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so he's interested in the last 40,000 years, and DNA suggests that that was an important time for the species. So he mentions a couple of time frames, and that time frame, or actually a bit longer ago than that, that's the time frame when our DNA was seeded. So that might be what he's referring to. So there's this idea that human DNA is, if you think we're in the family of apes and we're supposed to be ancestrally related to all of the big apes and the chimpanzees and so on, but they all have an extra chromosome. We have one less chromosome than they do. And one of our chromosomes is a fusion of two of those ape, the equivalent of those ape chromosomes. And so many people who think on an esoteric level have suggested that we were genetically engineered by a group of advanced beings, and most people think it was the Pleiadians. So that's my comment on over 40,000 years ago. And in actual fact, I think more like 50,000 years ago, that would be the era of Lemuria. And so Dennis is talking about most history as bunk. Well, most conventional history treats some of those things as fantasy, really, because there's no proof. But the idea is that there are advanced civilizations that occurred before the ones that we know about, and one of those was ancient Lemuria, which was this beginning of the human species as we know it, following that event that modified our genetic material. The second date that Dennis mentions is 8,000 years ago, and approximately, probably more like 10,000 years ago, was the last destruction of Atlantis. So Atlantis actually went through about 3 different cataclysms, but the very last one was about 10,000 years ago. And so since that last cataclysm of Atlantis, we've been, I guess, in a way, rebuilding. So, sometimes we really interpret history through our preconceived ideas, don't we? And one thing that I've always found kind of interesting is, people go searching for the lost city of Atlantis or the lost Lemurian civilization as though it was one thing. And both of those, if we call them, both of those societies, both of those cultures had multiple outposts, multiple cities, not just one. And yet we search for a single location and argue about where it is. But we don't have just one city. And look how old our civilization is, not very old at all. Those civilizations spanned tens of thousands of years. If you think our modern civilization, depending on where you want to start counting, if you want to start counting from Christ, it's 2,000 years. If you want to start counting from where they date the ancient Egyptians, maybe it's 5,000 or maybe 10,000. Okay, so those civilizations lasted a longer amount of time by thousands of years than ours did. So they're long-lived civilizations, and they're not just one thing. So just as you are not the same as an ancient Roman, imagine if Atlantis spanned 35,000 years. The people that you meet at 35,000 years ago are not going to be the same as the people 20,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. So it's not just one thing, it's not just one event, it's not just one city.
But also with that too, the knowledge isn't linear from the year 40,000 isn't exponential from the year 40,000. It curves up and goes down, curves up and goes down. You know, when you look at Atlantis, they were technically advanced as well.
But maybe not so in the beginning.
No, but not so in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a different perspective to look on it. And Dennis, I do hope you're listening. So I guess if we want to say history is bunk from that perspective, history is, in some senses, is myopic. And we, you know, so as a present day culture, we tend to see history through our eyes and our worldview. And that's quite a different worldview and a different perspective than an ancient civilization. And so, but because we are sort of blinkered by our own perspective, then that makes it very difficult for us to understand what actually was going on. And especially if we use our intellect rather than our intuition. And I suspect that most people who are historians and who are recording history, and I certainly, you know, I'm answering Dennis's question. I think there's probably some wonderful historians that do amazing work and archaeologists. But, you know, often we look through the lens of our present time culture. And our culture is a very intellectual one. But many cultures that existed in the past were much more intuitive, and they didn't operate in the same way or think the same way at all. And I think one example of this might be that there are many cultures that gave really strong credence to their dreams, where their waking life and their non-waking life had equal weighting. Their physical and non-physical experiences had equal weighting. And so that's a very different perspective on reality. You know, take the Australian Aborigines, they have a very different perspective on reality. Ooh.
Why don't you take a drink of water for 1 second, Dr. Leslie? And I've got something I'd like to add to that. When I was in high school, we didn't have computers, but we had these things called encyclopedias. And just as good parents today would buy their children a computer, good parents back then would buy an encyclopedia. Well, I had an Encyclopedia Britannica, and I remember I used to use it for doing research, quote unquote. And I did a paper on history once, and it was about one of the skirmishes between Canada and the United States very early on. And I have to say, I plagiarized it. I hated history, so I plagiarized it word for stupid enough, word for word. And so I handed it in, and I changed, you know, I dumbed it down a little bit, and I handed it in, and my teacher gave me an F on it. And the reason he gave me an F wasn't because I copied it. It was because it was the American point of view of the war, and it wasn't the true viewpoint that we in Canada had about the war. So I failed not because I copied something, but because history is bunk. In Canada, the U.S. history is bunk, and in the U.S., Canadian history is bunk. It's very interesting.
In the eye of the beholder. So,
yeah.
Good point. And I think another point that I would make, and hopefully we'll get more spiritual and a bit less intellectual as we go along, but our view of history changes as we evolve. New information becomes available to us at a rate that we can handle, and at a rate that we are evolving, and at a rate that is relevant and appropriate. So consider some of the things that, just consider some of the awful things that people used to believe about different races and the history of different races. You know, we've believed some pretty ridiculous things that nowadays we'd be shocked at. That was part of our historical perspective. You know, many of the European nations went around the world with this imperialistic view that their culture and society and history and was what mattered, and that they should go and obliterate everybody else's and impose theirs upon them. So, and we believe terrible things about the natives of the different countries. So, so our view of history has changed as we've evolved. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is we might say that the accuracy of the perspective on history varies as well. And like I said before, the best way to access the information is through your intuition, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment, and not intellectually. But let's just make up an example. Let's say an archaeologist discovers an artifact in an ancient Egyptian tomb, or in an ancient Egyptian temple, or an ancient Greek temple for that matter. And because he has got that artifact from, that level of history in that particular building, he might assume that this artifact belongs to that culture in that time frame. But what if that was just a collector's item? What if it was a museum piece already that people just had as a curiosity and were admiring, So things from different eras of history can get jumbled and muddled up together. You just have to think about people who are, art collectors or even buildings that are museums for us. All right.
Well, I heard something on the radio the other day, and it was an anthropologist, or not the guy who studied dinosaurs anyway, way back. And he said, we look at these dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus Rex, and we look at them as being a few here and a few there. He said, but when he did the study on them, he came up with, during that time period, there were 1.5 billion Tyrannosaurus Rex. Not just... So if you look at that, well, why aren't we finding zillions of bones and artifacts from these Tyrannosaurus Rex? And like he says, because the environment that they have to be saved in has to be perfect. So that would explain why we don't have relics from a lot of these past histories that people like to try and call bunk.
Yeah. Because it's such a long, long time ago. And also the geography of the planet has shifted.
Yeah, definitely.
What used to be above ground is now underwater, and vice versa. Anyway, listeners, you're tuning into Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey. And tonight's episode is based on a question received by one of our listeners, Dennis, who wants to get a spiritual perspective on history, but he's arguing history is bunk. We're responding to that argument. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back, listeners, to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey. And we're talking about ancient history and responding to a listener called Dennis, who asked the question, isn't history a load of old cobblers kind of thing? And so I'm going to give you a few. At the beginning, we had a few more intellectual arguments about it, but now I'm going to try and give some form of spiritual perspective on this. So let's take it on the individual level, because as individuals, many of us are attracted to different eras of history, aren't we? You might feel drawn or passionate about ancient Egypt, or the Mayan civilization, or the Gobi Desert, or the high altitude deserts of, Central America. I don't know, you might imagine yourself in Sicily or ancient Rome, or, have a particular affinity for a particular culture. And so each of us has our own unique interest, really, in history. And oftentimes that can relate to our own past lives, or possibly just that there's something for us to absorb and learn from that culture. So in that in that case, when we're looking at the uniqueness of each individual, everyone's got their own little slice of the history pie in a way that relates to them. And some of them might overlap and intersect, and some of them might not. So here's a mind-boggling thing for Dennis if he's listening. Everything exists here and now. So you think history is the past. From a spiritual perspective, everything exists here and now. And what history actually is a series of parallel realities which are in simultaneous coexistence to the reality that we are in. It appears to be linear to us because we are embedded in time and space. But from a higher spiritual perspective, it's all happening at once. Everything is existing now. And so it's very possible for us on an intuitive level to shift our energy to be in resonance with one of these parallel realities that we perceive to be history, and to glean information on an intuitive level about those civilizations. And for us as individuals, it's often easier for us to connect with civilizations that we have a counterpart in. So if you have a counterpart, another body from your same soul alive in ancient Rome, then you have a connection there and you can make that connection intuitively to investigate, find out more about it. And you know, many of our past civilizations had a really strong belief in reincarnation themselves. Many of them had a belief in future incarnations. So those lifetimes of yours that are embedded in that culture are going to be very, very open actually to connecting to a future version of themselves, which makes it easier for you to line up with that information stream. Another way, which I've done in some of my workshops, is to connect with your higher being and travel up in vibration to the level of your reality where all of your existences are perceivable. And then to just almost imagine them like a great network that you can travel between the nodes of that network and visit your own previous lifetimes, have conversations with them, and absorb information from them. And in actual fact, when you think, many of those past civilizations that had prophecies and predictions in their ancient texts and their indigenous cultures, many of those prophecies come from that kind of connection with that past time person with a future time version of themselves.
It's interesting when you think about it, because if you look at books themselves, books were very rare until the 1400s, when the printing press was invented, and then the Bible before that mostly was the Bible that got redid by hand. They had to write a book by hand, and so if you look back, the culture of history was mostly oral. It was an oral representation or some texts, but again, texts were very, if they were cuneiform or whatever, were very rare to find, and only the rich had them, and those ones got destroyed very easily as well because they weren't cared for in the same way our texts are cared for today. But when you think about it, if you look at the spiritual aspect of history, the Akashic records have everything that's ever existed in it. You can go into there and pick up information from anywhere along that record and pull out information, and it is accurate information as opposed to somebody's concept or view of it. Michelle Garris says that as well. So that is like there are more views to a story or a period in history. Same thing.
Absolutely, there absolutely are. And what's important to you in any historical lifetime tends to be the same kind of stuff in a way that's important today to people, isn't it? Relationships and, what do I do for a living? And, I think you can find some common human experiences throughout time and space, really. So and let's talk about this connecting and this interest to past civilizations, because what's relevant to any of us individually or personally about those prior civilizations is very human. It depends on your soul growth. What is of interest to you. So like I was just saying, you might have been alive in an amazing era of history when I don't know, alien species were living on the planet a long time beside humans, or giants roamed the earth, and yet what you're more focused on is is my husband being unfaithful to me, or whoever knows what it is. So and the reason I say that is when I think about the past life readings that I do, they tend to be for individuals. And so that's what we're connecting with, what is important to the individual, rather than a larger historical context of the era that we're in.
Brian has a comment on something you just said. He said, is that what happened when those two women in Versailles, when they were suddenly transported into the past briefly, when they turned that corner, hopefully you know what I'm referring to, it was widely reported, they kind of attuned to that plane of existence we view as the past?
So I'm not familiar with that particular story, but actually have a story. I had a client today who recounted that she was in the desert, where the energy is very clean and clear, staying in a house in the desert just recently. And she felt like she was simultaneously in ancient Greece at the same time that she was where she was. So I think those kind of experiences happen. And I always get the feeling that they're happening more frequently because of how the energies are, we're evolving more to having our multidimensional selves more accessible to us because of how the energies are changing and because of how we are changing. The other thing I wanted to comment on is, this idea that Dennis said, well, history is bunk. But in a way, what is important is the information relevant to you? So even if it isn't physically accurate, it could be energetically relevant and give you information that helps you move forward in your life. Do you get what I'm saying? We could have some incorrect historical information, but somehow that story in itself fascinates you and has an impact on you. So whatever you choose to believe or are attracted to in any moment is always accurate for you and is always relevant for you. Although, you could argue over its historical relevancy and accuracy, it could still have a relevance. The other thing I wanted to say is, to some degree, history is founded on belief. You may believe the Earth was invaded by reptilians and it remains under their control through the royal family. That might be your history of planet Earth, and it may be really real for you. You completely believe it. That's your historical fact. And you believing that serves a purpose for you. But my version of history might be different, and it serves a purpose for me. And really, as we were saying earlier, since all possibilities exist, you're tapping into one idea of history, and I'm tapping into a different idea of history.
Right. Since we all write our own scripts for life before we get to this life, I mean, it must have everything that happens must have some significance in our day to day, regardless of how long ago it was or how far in the future it might come in.
And if you sort of take the idea of everything is now and that you're just resonating with a particular place in space and time, that moment that you're in can have a history embedded within it. And then as you shift realities to a different moment, the history that's embedded in that can shift and you wouldn't even notice because you're completely embedded in that particular timeline that you're in. But there are cases of people who've had those glitches where they feel like they jump timelines and they are conscious of a different history having been embedded. And actually one example of that, I think, and someone listening can correct me if I'm wrong, is the Mandela effect. That there was a group of people that believed one history for Nelson Mandela and another, like I think there was a group of people that believed he died in prison or something like that. And then there was another group who, you know, he lived to the current version of history for. But it's called I think it's called the Mandela effect, where history shifts within the group consciousness. And it's actually those glitches have been noticed by some people. All right, well, okay, so that's kind of some thoughts on Dennis's question. And I'm happy to really just open up to other listeners' questions. And if you want to know about any particular time in history, maybe we can have a psychic look at that time in history. Or maybe if you're just curious of an era in history that you were alive in and want to know more about it, feel free to ask away.
Brian says the Mandela effect. That's correct. That is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's, you know, when you look at, so we were talking about doing a channeling, but have you gotten information? Like Brian said something a little earlier here. He says it seems like events that are foreseen also have a large emotional component to them, like 9/11 or the sinking of the Titanic. And you've had experiences of foreseeing that type of drastic event.
Yeah. So are you asking for a comment on that? Was that you, Corey?
No, I just like to talk and listen to myself talk. Yeah, well, exactly. Like he's saying it's foreseen, have a large emotional component to it. So what he's equating future events like past events. The past events have emotional, but so do future events. So when you're looking at the spiritual aspect of events, whether you're looking in the now, in the future, or in the past, there is an emotionality behind them. And without emotion, and if they're not real, there is no emotion. I mean, you could look at a picture and it might give you emotion because it's a picture of something that you recognize. But
well, okay, so they've done precognition is one of the most scientifically studied aspects of intuition, and they have demonstrated that there tends to be an emotional component in that. What most people are having premonitions about is something that's going to happen to someone that's close to them. You know, like a relative's going to have a heart attack or pass away or something like that. But I guess you might say a similar thing for some of those big disasters like 9/11, that was hugely emotional on a planetary level.
Katie says, I would love to know where and when I've lived, or who was my role in society, or any relevant information you can please tell me. Thank you in advance.
Okay, well, I will take a look at that, BB. And
I teach ancient civilizations to sixth graders. Oh, that's interesting.
that is interesting.
I didn't know that, Katie. Thank you.
And so most of us, what was the name again?
Katie.
Haiti.
Katie.
Katie.
Katie with a K.
Thank you, because I thought you said BB at the beginning. Katie. All right. Yes. We'll take a look, and bear in mind that you've had many lifetimes, and so we're only going to look at maybe one that's a good example.
And why don't we do that after the break, though? Because it's about only a minute from break time, and I'd hate to cheat her out of.
All right, listeners, we're going to have a break for a few messages, and then we will come back. Welcome back, listeners, to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey. Tonight's episode is a little bit different than what we normally do, but we're answering a listener's question who said history is bunk. We're on to that time in the show where we answer your questions. And so Katie wants to know some information about who she's been in past lifetimes. And actually, you know what's showing up on your past lifetime, Katie, is actually a very recent past life rather than an ancient one. So I guess I'll just trust that and go along with it, because it is a lifetime in the 1920s where you were an archaeologist. And I'm seeing you be in a male body. And do you know what? It reminds me that there's a famous Egyptologist, and his name is, I think his surname is Carter, from that era or thereabouts. And gosh, I even wonder if that you were him, because it looks like pictures I've seen of him. So, but anyway, yeah, I'm seeing that you were an archaeologist and that you had a role in helping the modern society that you were in understand history and ancient civilizations. And I'm seeing that it was absolutely fascinating work, that you absolutely loved it, was so enthusiastic and keen on it. And it afforded you a very interesting life, because you got to travel, you got to discover things. And it looks like you got to hobnob and interact with some very wealthy people, because they were, you were looking for, constantly looking for funding for what you were doing. And those sponsors were, they wanted their name associated with what was discovered. So isn't it interesting that you're a history teacher today? Because it looks like you probably know quite a bit about what you're talking about. All right. I hope that was interesting for you, Katie.
Thank you, Dr. Leslie.
You're
So
welcome.
Michelle says, in 1890 AD, were people in Rome hot and sweaty? I'm trying to confirm a past life reading.
1890 AD is not that long ago, is it? That's
They didn't have air conditioning back then. I know that for sure.
I guess it depends what time of year it was, but
Yeah, true.
But I think I'm looking at maybe some of the pictures that you're looking at, and so I would say it looks like, yes, there was a hot and sweaty time.
Yeah. Well, the soldiers wore those short skirts, so.
That's 1890 AD is not BC. That's like recent. That's like 130 years ago.
No, 890.
890, not 1890.
No, 890.
Oh, okay. Give me a second. Tuning into the wrong era of history. Yeah, I was seeing, it's funny when you said 1890. I was seeing like a priest in a long black robe fanning himself with a newspaper. Okay, 890 AD. And this is Michelle. So let's just take a look at Michelle's past life timeline then. Well, Michelle, why don't you type a bit more information about the past life that you're curious about? Because I would say Rome is in Europe, and sometimes it's hot and sweaty, and sometimes it's cold. And look, I'm just seeing the same for 1890 in a way. So give us a little bit more information of what you're trying to verify.
So I have a quick question on that. So is there any difference when you do a past life reading? Is there any difference when you're current in this civilization, basically since in the past 10,000 years, or traveling back to Atlantis or Lemuria?
Any difference?
Yeah, is there any difference for you? Do you see a difference other than what you're seeing? But is there anything unusual about either of those three as far as going back in that past life? Are they all the same? Do they all?
I've been back to some prehistory times where Facebook is frozen. I've been back to some prehistory times where the atmosphere feels rarefied, and that's sort of back way back, almost pre-Lemurian, or Lemurian times and pre-Lemurian times, that that the energy's not as dense as it is today. But otherwise, I don't really know what you're getting at, but no, it's like just tuning into that era.
Okay. No, I'm just curious because it's if you've read history books, you've read the history books on basically our whole civilization at some point in time, or seen a movie or something like that. So you have those preconceived notions, and which is wonderful. But when you're going back to Lemuria, I was wondering if you have issues recognizing anything, or not being able to translate what you're seeing into.
Okay, so yeah, sometimes there are unusual technologies or unusual things that you might not see in modern times, but there's a knowing that comes with the seeing, where you just automatically know what it is. So, when I'm doing the readings, I'm not using my intellect, and I'm not using my preconceived notions based on this era about what it is I'm looking at. I'm entering into a more spiritual dimension of knowingness, and and seeing and hearing, because sometimes my healing guides are telling me what the information is as well. So it's a different way of getting information that's not intellectual. So you can it's sort of like I could see you in a past life and you might look completely different. So how the heck do I know it's you? By your energy signature. Everyone has a unique energy signature.
Yeah. So just so those people are aware, Facebook has completely dropped out.
I've got it back up.
Oh, okay, there it is.
Yeah. No one has joined it yet, though.
Yeah. So just come back up. Anyway, okay. Thank you, Dr. Leslie.
That's because you said at the beginning, no technical issues.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So Michelle added to her, I look back, I don't know if it was me or someone else. I was a teacher in a white robe and I was poisoned by my husband. I saw people were hot and sweaty.
Oh. Okay, so maybe it just happened in the summertime, Michelle. Okay, past life, poisoned by your husband. Just looks to me like that's a vignette from, I am seeing the picture. Looks like it was some kind of herbal thing that poisoned you, to me. And yeah, I think it just was in the summertime. That's why they're hot and sweaty.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you Menjai. Oh, Menjio. MENGJIAO. let's call her Olive. Her name's Olive. I seem to have feeling memories from previously destroyed worlds, and it gives me much anxiety. Like I have to do something about it in this life, this earth. Can we look that?
Yeah. And those kind of memories in a way are relatively common, and oftentimes it's because you've been in a destruction of a civilization, which could be anything from Pompeii to one of the Atlantean destructions, or even to, like you said, a destroyed world. So if we look at the history beyond our planet, where did we come from? Because we didn't just appear here on Earth. And so one of my perspective on that trajectory is that there is a star system called Lyra, and we came through what they say the gates of Lyra into this current universe, and the Lyrans seeded the Pleiadians and the Syrians, who seeded us on Earth. But those Lyran civilizations, it's actually where the thought and idea of Star Wars comes from, because there were worlds destroyed. So having said that, let me go in trance and take a look where your feeling is coming from. I feel like it is a galactic memory, Olive, of a very ancient planetary level destruction. And then if I look at your Earth timeline as well, then I'm also seeing that you have had some experiences. I'm seeing one relates to a volcanic eruption, a very long time ago, but a volcanic eruption that was very large and destroyed quite a lot of the area around it. And then there was another lifetime that was coming up. So let me see what that's to do with. Yeah, this one's like an earthquake and with mudslides and things. So I'll just say, like I said, those memories can come from different places. They can come from past lives. Many people who have memories of the Atlantean destructions, and it can even be an off-planet thing as well.
So Michelle just adds, she said, the name Carnila came to me 1890 AD in Rome. Someone was trying to say that their hygiene was good. Okay, so let's go forward. Brian has a question. Facebook is back, so there's a couple of people on there. I think they dropped out and Katie went to YouTube. So Dr. Leslie, this is from Brian. Dr. Leslie, I'd like to know what, if anything, you can tell me regarding any past lifetimes that may be impacting my current lifetime, affecting it, or has relevance to it. All of them, Brian.
No, not all of them. All right. So I'm getting one that's about 40% of the way down your Earth timeline. Let's see what it is. Well, just for Corey, it's a strange structure that's interesting to translate. So give me a moment.
Just for me?
But it's like a carving, but it's horizontal, and it's got different symbols on it. So it reminds me of the kind of thing like an astrological wheel or a feng shui wheel, but it's not either of those things. It is a carving that is depicting some kind of, I'm just checking to see if it's astronomical or astrological relationships or some sort of just esoteric thing. It feels like things can be moved around on it. So it's almost like little blocks or bricks that can be lifted out and placed in different positions, slotted in different positions. It's made of stone. It's like a stone carving. And I'm seeing you be in a male body, and that's what you're doing. You are adjusting these pieces that fit together in this object. So let's see what that has to do with. Well, actually, what you're showing me, I mean, is that it's almost like it's almost what you're showing me is it's almost like a printing press, like an ancient printing press or a screen printing thing. Because what you showed me was, and again, you know, I think the pattern on this is important, but somehow a piece of, and it's not really fabric, it's more like leather actually, but a piece of leather is laid over this, and that the impression of these symbols gets imprinted on the leather. So you're, and it looks like these are things that are relating to some kind of army or military type use. So we wanted to say that you are, we'd call you an artisan, but in service to, looks like in service to the military, like a blacksmith would be, but it's not a blacksmith, it's a kind of leather worker. But these special, I wonder if it's shields because it's round, because it's round. I was seeing, you know, people wearing sort of primitive armor. I was seeing one of these things sort of hoisted a bit like a flag. But I, you know, so let's call you a shield maker. And it looks like the culture would be, I don't know if I'm right saying the Middle East, but it looks like, you know, in the Holy Wars, you had the Knights Templar on one side, and then you had the Moors on the other side. It's some group that comes from more that Moorish type of idea, but they are, I think it's a little bit further past in history than the Moors. So the Moors might be a bit more recent, the Saracens or something. Yeah, if that's the right word. So yeah, that's what that's the lifetime that's popped up. And but what seems to be important to you is this idea that these symbols need to be exactly right. And it's almost like because they tell the story of who these warriors are or who these soldiers are, and that imprinting is you know, maybe it helps them be supported by the gods or channel the fierce energy or something. All right, I'm being
Unfortunately, we can't get any more questions in, Dr. Leslie, but everybody can keep their questions for next week, and we'd be happy to answer them next week.
And feel free to send in your questions, because that's the way to get your, or show suggestions, because that's the way to get shows done that are really interesting to you.
Yeah. And get your answer question first up online. Wonderful. See you guys all next week.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to CIVL 101.7 FM on the Fraser Valley. Bye. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillipscomp.com. That's drlesleyphillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.